Hello and welcome to another edition of Theology Thursday. Throughout the Bible, we find a word that occurs hundreds of times, and that is the word holy. The most concentrated occurrence is in Leviticus 17:27. It's the second half of the book of Leviticus, basically, and we find the word holy occurring all over the place there, but it occurs in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It occurs in the Psalms. It occurs all over the New Testament, in every single gospel. It occurs in many of Paul's letters. It occurs even at the end of the Bible. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory, says Isaiah 6. And then in Revelation, we discover that the angels are singing basically the same thing. Holy, holy, holy is Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And so this word holy occurs a lot of places. So what does it mean, holy, or to be holy? The Bible describes God as holy. There are the holy things that belong to the Lord. Those usually are all the items related to the temple. But we are also told to be holy. The Bible in several places says, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." It occurs both in Leviticus and in 1 Peter. 1 Peter quotes from Leviticus. And so the Bible is full of calls to holiness. So what does it mean to be holy? What is the fundamental idea of holy? Well, let's take a moment to talk about what it's not, talk a little bit about how we understand the Old Testament in particular and how that relates to the New Testament, and then we'll talk about holiness, and hopefully this will all come together and make sense. First of all, holiness is not a level of spirituality. You don't get like holier. There aren't people who are holier than others. We talk about a holy man, it's not like that. So you don't start off kind of somewhere and then eventually become holy, like that's some level of Christianity or spirituality or something like that. Holy also is not defined by religious activity, holy actions kind of thing. It's not like that. In the Bible, there are places that are holy, but that doesn't mean that somehow those places are magical or something like that. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses encounters God at the burning bush. And God says, "Take off the sandals from your feet because the ground you're standing on is holy." And the idea there is that Moses would take off the sandals because he's in the house of God. He's in the presence of God. Not that there's somehow some kind of magic place and that a holy man is going to say some incantation to make something happen. It's not like that either. Matter of fact, we oftentimes think of holy as kind of a negative thing. It's holier than thou, or someone thinks, "Oh boy, they really think you're holy, don't you?" As though it's an attitude that we have that somehow we are at some particular spiritual plane, and it's not like that. So what is holiness then according to the Bible? Well, to understand it, we have to understand that in the Old Testament, it's all about imagery. It's all about pictures. God's described as our shepherd. God is our guardian. The Old Testament doesn't just say that, well, God's good to you or God's done some good stuff for you. Instead, he's opened the windows of heaven because they were farmers. And so the windows of heaven is rain. And so when the rain comes, that's the blessing of God. Malachi says, "Bring your tithes and offerings into the storehouse, and I will open up the windows of heaven and pour out my blessings on you." The pouring out is literally the rain. The rain's being poured out from heaven. And when it rains, the crops grow, and there's an abundance and plenty for all. And so there's always kind of that imagery, and it's oftentimes related to agriculture. It's probably the number one image. But the Old Testament's full of imagery. So you don't live a life for the Lord, you walk with the Lord. It's an image of walking down a path with God. Even like on the Day of Atonement, there's the picture of the sin being placed on the scapegoat. There's the image of the lamb that dies for the sins of the people. It's just the Bible's full of imagery, the Old Testament in particular. And the writers of the New Testament, with maybe one or two exceptions, are all Jewish. And they're steeped in the Old Testament, so they talk in imagery as well. The Apostle Paul uses lots of imagery. Put on the whole armor of God. The Apostle Paul talks a lot about walking the pathway. The Apostle Paul likes to use a lot of He uses a lot of that imagery. The middle wall has been broken down between Jew and Gentile. We are the temple of the living God, he would say in Ephesians. And so the New Testament's full of imagery like that. Revelation, of course, is packed full of imagery. So I'm saying this to say that when we come to terms like holy, there's a picture behind it. There's an image. And when we understand the image, then we should be able to understand what it means to be holy. So the fundamental idea of the word holy means to be separate, be separated. So God is holy because he's separated from us. He's not like us. He's God, and we are not. And so that's why the Bible talks so much about God being holy. But for you and me to be holy, there's a real clear, simple image here that I hope will help you understand what it means to live a life that's holy. And I want to show you I'm going to use an image to help us understand the image of holiness in the Bible. So the Bible kind of views the world in two sections. There's really no middle ground. And on one side of the line, we have God. On the other side, we have the world. In the Old Testament, that's normally the ites, the Hittites and Amorites and Canaanites and all the others. In the New Testament, they typically use the phrase the world, meaning the world's system, their values, and all of that. Now, everyone, in a sense, is holy in the sense that everyone is separated. So here's kind of the way it works. If you're separated to God, you are separated from the world. So if you love the things of God, you will hate the things of this world. So when you and I are called to be holy, we are called to live our lives on the God side of the line, to follow God's values and God's morals and God's ethics and God's way of treating people. That's why we're loving and kind and compassionate and gracious and gentle and always want to put other people before ourselves and are willing to set aside our own rights so that we can help someone else to be better in life and to minister to them. I mean, that's what we do. Jesus came to lay down his life for us and calls us to lay down our lives for others. And so we are separated to God that way. And when you do that, you're separated from the world's values of get what you can, use people for your own advantage, your own benefit, your own pleasure, whatever it is. This life is what we live for and trying to get the most out of this life. And you might sacrifice for people, but oftentimes there's an ulterior motive because it makes you feel better or whatever it is. And so I want to give our graphic here again. If you're separated to God, you're separated from the world. And so to be holy means we live on the God side of the line, okay, by God's laws and principles and values. Now you may be thinking, okay, but what if I'm not separated to God? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at our graphic again. So we still have two sides. But if you are set aside to the world, you are set aside from God. So it runs both ways. So when the Bible calls us to be holy, it's calling us to come out from the world's system and the world's values and the world's goals and the world's objectives and what the world thinks are important in some kind of value structure and to live by God's values. That's what it means to be holy, to live on the God side of the line, to live the way that God would have us to live. That's why you can't get holier. You're either on that side of the line or not. Now, the reality is we don't always live on that side of the line like we ought to. But God's people are to be holy. The Bible says that we are a holy nation in Exodus, and again, that's quoted in 1 Peter, that we are to be a holy people. We're to be separated to God. We have a different set of values and standards than the world does. Now, what this means, obviously, and we'll just go back and look again, is that we're going to have conflict. I mean, that's just, let's go back and here we are. So this is the way we should be. If this is how we are, we're going to have conflict with the world. They're going to have a different set of values. They're going to define gender differently. They're going to define marriage differently. They're going to define the value of life differently. They're going to define honesty differently. They're going to define work ethic differently. They're going to define suffering and sacrifice and grace, all of these things differently than we do. And so there's going to be conflict because they're separated from us because they are separated to the world. So holiness is not complicated and it's not some super level of spirituality. Holiness is when I say, I want to live my life on the God side of the line. I want to live my life by the values and standards that God has given in His Word. I've set myself apart to him. Because if you don't set yourself apart to God, by default, you've set yourself apart to the world, which means you set yourself apart from God. And that's not who we want to be. We want to be people that are holy to the Lord, that are on God's side of the line. And that's where we live and move and have our being. And so it's really not that difficult to think of being holy. That's why you and I, when we've been saved, God has moved us to his side of the line. We belong to him. He has separated us out to himself, called out for himself a people. And now he says to you and me, we need to live like people who have been called out to that side of the line. Live like people who are called to be holy to the Lord, to be set apart and set aside to him on his side of the line. So don't be depressed and discouraged because you don't think you're holy enough. If you want your life lived by God's values and to be pleasing to God, you're holy. You're separating yourself to him. You're dedicating yourself to him. If you want nothing to do with the things of God and you'll live by your own values and the world's values, you're separated from God. It's just you can't have both. To be for one makes you by default against the other. So for me, I'm on the God side of the line. That's where I want to be and that's where I want to live. And I hope it's the same for you today. So I hope today that you'll live a holy life, a life on God's side of the line. God bless you. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and may God empower you to live on his side of the line.